The early morning light touched the ramparts of Winterfell with gentle gold, rousing the crows perched upon the ancient stone. The air was still, the hush of dawn broken only by the rustling of leaves that clung to the last hint of summer. The courtyard below was quiet as well, and few souls dared to stir before the sun had fully crested the horizon. Yet, in the Godswood, under the reddening leaves of the heart tree, Bran Stark was already awake. He shifted under a thick woolen blanket on the mossy ground. His legs, still weak from his fall, were stretched out before him, and near his side lay the smooth wooden brace that Maester Luwin had fashioned. He had only recently grown more comfortable venturing out in his wheelchair, yet on mornings like this, he found some measure of freedom in simply dragging himself across the dew-kissed grass to the base of the weirwood. It was a private time, his time to think and dream, or to remember the fragments of dreams that seemed more like visions than his own imaginings. Ever since the accident, his sleeps had been filled with shapes and shadows that whispered in languages half forgotten. And sometimes, a voice like the wind came to him, urging him to see what others could not. He reached for the bark of the weirwood, and placed his small hand against it. The trunk was smooth in some parts, gnarled in others, and he felt a faint pulse beneath it. He closed his eyes. In the darkness of his lids, a swirl of images arose without warning. The silhouette of a man with mocking green eyes standing behind his father's broad back. A gleaming silver dagger with a curved handle pressed against his father's throat. And the feeling of betrayal so cold it might have been forged from northern ice. It came in a rush that was too real, too immediate. He jerked his hand away, panting, disoriented. He had no reason to see such a scene. Yet it felt more than a passing nightmare. It felt like a memory from a time that had not yet happened. He swallowed hard, pressing a palm against the damp moss as he let the dizziness subside. The only voice in the Godswood now was the wind, moaning softly through the red leaves. Although Bran was only a child, part of him understood that the old gods spoke in signs and riddles. He had seen glimpses of strange futures before, had tried to make sense of them, but they floated away like leaves on a swift stream. This morning, though, he had woken with a determination that came from deep within. He knew there was more at stake than just his father's life. He could not keep this to himself any longer. Steeling himself, Bran called for Hodor, his gentle giant of a companion, who waited just beyond the line of trees. Hodor, who wore a perpetual smile and never seemed to fully grasp the darkness of the world, came at once. Carefully, he lifted Bran into the padded seat of the wheelchair, and together they made their slow, steady way back to the castle corridors that branched off the courtyard. Ned Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, was standing near the main gates, talking quietly with Robb, Theon Greyjoy, and a few others tasked with the day's duties. They spoke in hushed tones about gathering forces, preparing for a journey to King's Landing, and ensuring the winter stores were maintained properly in their lord's absence. Ned's face held the weight of responsibility. He would soon be leaving, taking his daughters with him, and the burden was evident in the way his gray eyes scanned the keep, as though memorizing every tower and battlement. Bran approached, his heart beating a little faster. Ever since his fall, he had felt that his father tried to shield him from certain truths, or to comfort him with half-answers. But he was no longer so small or naive. If he had something important to say, he had to say it plainly. So he waited until Ned had finished his instructions for the day. Theon and Robb parted, each with a courteous nod in Bran's direction, and soon it was just Bran, Hodor, and his father standing by the great stone steps. Ned's gaze softened the moment he turned to Bran. "Good morning, my boy," he said gently. "Are you well?" "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep," Bran replied. He glanced at Hodor, who lingered, uncertain if Bran needed more help. "Thank you, Hodor. You can wait for me by the stables if you like." Hodor smiled and nodded, wandering off obediently. Then, in a quieter voice, Bran turned back to Ned. "Father, I need to speak with you in private." A faint worry etched itself upon Ned's brow. He reached out and placed a hand on Bran's shoulder. "Of course," he said. "Let's find somewhere quiet." He led Bran inside, up a winding flight of stairs, past a corridor lined with winter tapestries and old iron sconces. They arrived at Ned's solar, the place where he often took letters from the king or consulted with Maester Luwin. It was sparsely furnished, only a stout wooden desk, an old chair, and a single window that overlooked the courtyard. Once Bran was inside, Ned shut the door and took a seat on a bench near the window, beckoning Bran closer. Bran turned the wheels of his chair, stopping just a few feet from his father. He gathered his courage. "Father," he began, "I've been having dreams, strange ones. And visions." Ned's eyes narrowed slightly. "You've mentioned these before," he said gently. "But you know the Maester says that dreams are—" "This is different," Bran insisted, his voice trembling a little. "It's not just any dream. It felt too real. I saw someone hurting you, a man with a mocking smile, and you looked so surprised, as if you didn't think he'd ever dare turn on you." Ned's lips parted, but for a moment, no words emerged. He composed himself, leaning forward, trying to appear calm. "Son," he said, "whatever you saw, it was just a dream. There are many in King's Landing who might wish to do me harm if they had the chance. Such is the way of the court, but I promise I will be careful." Bran shook his head. "It was Littlefinger," he blurted out, barely understanding the name's significance, only knowing it from the occasional talks I'd overheard. "Pater Baelish. I saw him with a knife to your throat. He was smiling. And there was blood." Ned's gaze hardened, the line of his mouth going grim. "Littlefinger," he echoed. "He was once a ward of the Tullys, your mother's family. He's an old friend, or so he pretends. He helped me when I visited the Vale years ago. He and your mother are well acquainted. Why would he turn on me?" "I don't know," Bran said, his voice faint. "But it wasn't like a dream, and I can't bear it if you don't listen." He lifted his chin in a gesture of courage, though tears stung his eyes. "You have to promise me you'll be wary of him." Ned's face was a mix of skepticism and worry. He rose from the bench and walked over to the desk, resting his hands on the worn surface. The early sunlight streaming through the window highlighted the silver flecks in his dark hair, the lines of responsibility etched into his features. "Bran," he began carefully, "I know you've been through a terrible ordeal, and I do believe in your instincts, but King's Landing is full of intrigues. I can't declare Littlefinger an enemy without cause. Still, I will heed your warning. I promise." Bran nodded, relief coursing through him, though he could still feel the tremors of dread that had been building inside him. "That's all I ask," he said softly. Ned came around and placed a strong, reassuring hand on the back of Bran's chair. "You should rest," he told his son. "I'll be leaving soon, but you must take care of yourself here. You're the Stark in Winterfell now, alongside Robb. Soon enough you'll be walking the walls again. I'm sure of it." Bran wanted to believe that, but he said nothing. He only nodded and let his father wheel him to the door. The subject of his warning hung in the air. There was no jest, no indulgent smile that suggested Ned thought it was mere child's fancy. Bran was glad for that. He needed his father to take him seriously. In the courtyard, after Ned had gone, Bran saw Robb instructing the guards to gather supplies for their father's journey. Arya was scurrying around somewhere with her practice sword, and Sansa was likely in her chambers, thinking of King's Landing as a place of songs and chivalry. Nobody else noticed Bran's distress. He tilted his head back, watching a pair of ravens glide overhead. Would his warning truly make a difference? Or would Ned find himself ensnared by the city's political webs all the same? That question clung to Bran for the rest of the day, and he found no true solace even when old Nan tried to spin stories of heroes and giants to distract him from the gloom. When evening came, he returned to the Godswood, letting the quiet of nature calm his racing thoughts. But the memory of that knife at his father's throat lingered. The next days passed in a blur of preparation. Carriages were loaded with the Starks' belongings, horses saddled, and men assigned to accompany Lord Eddard. Word had arrived that the king was growing impatient, and that time was of the essence. By the day of departure, the castle was alive with the stomping of boots, the creak of wagon wheels, and the whickering of horses. The southern sky was thick with clouds, but no rain had yet fallen, as if even the weather was holding its breath. Before he mounted his horse, Ned stood in front of the great keep, speaking words of farewell to Robb and to Bran. He repeated his promise to keep Littlefinger's supposed treachery in mind, though he tried to keep his voice low, out of earshot of any curious servants or guardsmen. He squeezed Bran's hand. "Sometimes it is hard to know friend from foe," he said quietly. "But I will trust your instincts as well as my own caution." Bran watched his father ride out, flanked by his household guard, accompanied by Sansa in a carriage and Arya on a dark gray mare. The moment they crossed the main gate, Bran felt a pang of regret. Part of him wanted to beg his father not to go. Part of him wanted to join them, to see the city of the South with his own eyes, to prove that his mind was not confined even though his legs were. But he was still so weak, and the journey would be long and dangerous. All he could do was watch the column of riders vanish into the distance, and hope his warning would not be in vain. The days after Ned's departure grew quieter in Winterfell. Robb presided over matters with measured confidence, consulting Maester Luwin, and seeking advice from the older lords who remain. The snows had not yet come in full force, and the crisp air spoke of a season in transition. Bran tried to occupy himself by learning more of the histories from Luwin or letting Rickon race around him in playful circles, but often his thoughts strayed southward, to the capital he had never seen. Sometimes, he even found himself tempted to revisit those strange dreams, as if by focusing on them, he might glean more detail, some additional clue that could help his father. But each night, he only saw fleeting hints, the swirl of a cloak, the glint of steel, Littlefinger's sly grin. It was enough to keep him uneasy, never enough to form a concrete plan. Word arrived from King's Landing in the form of ravens, bearing short messages from Ned to Maester Luwin. They were polite letters, with the Lord's seal, and they contained updates about the King's Court and Sansa's introduction to the splendors of the capital. But they gave no sign of immediate danger. Ned mentioned that Petyr Baelish had extended courtesies, offering him help in navigating the complexities of the royal finances and the intrigues of the small council. There was no evidence of betrayal. If anything, Littlefinger had been quite helpful, though Ned's letter did note the man's penchant for secrets and half-smiles. When Bran read these lines, he felt a chill pass over him. He couldn't help but wonder if the cunning smile was the precursor to that horrifying glimpse he had seen in the vision. Still, days turned to weeks, and no more direct warnings came. Bran carried a certain tension in his chest, as though waiting for a thunderstorm that refused to break. In Winterfell, there was comfort and routine. He rose in the mornings, ate with Robb and Rickon in the Great Hall, then spent hours in the library or in the Godswood, letting Hodor push him along rough-hewn paths. He listened to the blacksmith's hammer ring out from the forge, watched the kennelmaster tend to the hounds, heard the soft lullaby of the wind in the high towers. And at night, he tried to steel himself against the dream that wouldn't leave him. One such night, well past the usual hour of rest, he found himself in the Godswood again, under the faint moonlight. His wheelchair was difficult to maneuver on the damp ground, but Hodor managed it, as always. The heart tree's face seemed more solemn than usual, its carved eyes catching the moon's glow in a way that made Bran's heart quicken. He placed his hand against the bark once more, closed his eyes, and breathed in the night air. There was a rush of color and motion behind his eyelids, and suddenly, he was seeing through the eyes of a raven soaring over a wide moonlit courtyard. Guards with golden cloaks paced below, their boots echoing on marble. He recognized the red keep from old sketches and descriptions. This was King's Landing, far away in the south. The raven swooped lower, and through a high window Bran glimpsed a group of men huddled around a table. Ned Stark was there, his face stern and proud, and beside him stood Petyr Baelish, leaning in with a conspiratorial tilt of his head. Bran's heart hammered as he watched, though he could not hear the words they spoke. There was a heated exchange, hands were raised, and Ned's expression was one of disbelief. It was as if he had just discovered something devastating. Then, swift as a snake, Littlefinger stepped back, a knife in hand, and lunged. The vision blurred. The raven cawed in alarm, flapping wildly. Before Bran could see more, he jolted awake, nearly sliding from his seat. Hodor caught him just in time, letting out a worried, soft, "Hodor?" Bran's breath came in ragged gasps. So the dream had come again, but now more vivid, more immediate. He fumbled for Hodor's arm, steadying himself. "Take me back," he managed, his voice trembling. "Take me back to my room." Hodor carried him carefully across the yard and up the steps, and Bran felt numb. He wanted to scream at the night sky, to let the whole world know that danger crept at his father's heels. But he was helpless, all the way in Winterfell. Ned had only said he would be cautious. Would that truly be enough? Bran had done all he could. Or had he? That question tormented him through a restless night, and by morning, he was pale and exhausted. Maester Luwin asked if he needed more rest, but Bran only shook his head. Days later, a raven arrived from Ned Stark himself, addressed to Bran. That was unusual. In the note, written in a brisk but affectionate style, Ned thanked Bran for warning him about Littlefinger, though he added that he did not believe Petyr Baelish meant him any personal harm. He reiterated that the man had been of service, helping him gather evidence about the Lannisters. Apparently, Ned had discovered that the Queen's children might not truly be the King's. Bran's eyes widened at that revelation. He'd never dreamed such a secret might come to light. Ned was investigating, and it seemed Petyr Baelish was aiding him, or at least giving him resources to pry deeper. "I have not shared your suspicions with anyone," Ned's letter continued, "for I fear it would only sow discord. Rest assured I keep my eyes open, and I remember your words. But so far, Lord Baelish has done nothing to suggest he is not my friend. I hope this comforts you. When I return north, I will have many tales to tell you, my son." Bran stared at the letter for a long time, rereading it in the flickering candlelight of the solar. On one hand, he felt relief to hear that Ned was unharmed and that everything seemed stable. On the other, a nagging voice inside him warned that Littlefinger was cunning enough to win anyone's trust. Perhaps Ned only believed he had the measure of the man. Perhaps in the end, that belief would be his undoing. Bran could only pray to the old gods that his father would see the truth before it was too late. Autumn progressed into a delicate dance between lingering warmth and encroaching chill. The nights grew longer, and talk of winter's approach was on every tongue in the north. More soldiers arrived to pledge fealty to Robb Stark in Ned's absence, and the routines of the castle shifted to accommodate them. Bran began to notice how life without Ned changed subtle aspects of their daily existence. The older men missed their lord's presence and counsel. The younger ones tested boundaries to see what new freedoms they might take advantage of. Yet Robb held them together with a calm hand, a strong memory of Ned's sense of duty guiding every decision. One afternoon, as Bran practiced archery from the seat of his modified chair, still determined to keep some skill with the bow, Maester Luwin approached with another raven. This one contained only a few sentences, and his expression was grave as he handed it to Bran. Bran's heart pounded while he read. It was from Ned's steward in King's Landing, stating that Lord Eddard Stark had been wounded in an altercation with the Lannisters. The steward wrote that rumors abounded about how it had started. But one thing was certain: Ned was injured and bedridden at the moment. He was under the care of the royal maester, but the steward had no further details. Bran felt cold. There was no mention of Littlefinger, no mention of the betrayal he had foreseen. Yet this was proof enough that the capital was every bit as dangerous as he had feared. He lowered the note, staring at the archery target that stood some distance away in the courtyard. The arrows he had managed to shoot wobbled in the straw, none of them hitting the center. Had his father's caution not been enough? Or had this come from an entirely different quarter? But if his father was truly wounded, it meant others might sense weakness. And that was exactly when Littlefinger would strike. He turned to Maester Luwin. "How bad is it?" The small man shook his head. "I'm afraid the details are scarce. If I receive more news, I'll inform you at once, Bran." Bran clenched the parchment in his hands. "I want to send a raven," he declared. "I want to remind Father to watch out for Littlefinger. He might have forgotten in the confusion." Luwin sighed. "We can send a raven, but we must be discreet. The King's court is not a place to levy accusations without proof. If this letter were intercepted—" "I don't care," Bran said, surprising himself with the passion in his voice. "Father needs to be warned again." So they composed a short message, carefully worded, stating that Bran feared for Ned's safety in the midst of all this chaos. He urged him once more not to trust anyone blindly, especially not Petyr Baelish. The letter was sealed with the direwolf sigil of House Stark and sent off at once. Bran felt marginally better. though anxiety gnawed at him day and night as he waited for a response. When the next raven came, it was Sansa's handwriting that greeted Bran, a shaky script filled with frantic emotion. She wrote that their father had discovered secret truths about the royal family, that the queen had acted harshly, and now Ned was under great scrutiny. Sansa mentioned that Lord Baelish had interceded at times, but she was not certain of his true intentions. The tension in King's Landing had reached a fever pitch, and many whispered that a conflict was brewing between House Stark and House Lannister. Bran's pulse raced. His nightmares echoed in those lines. The sense of impending doom so thick, he could almost taste it. As the days wore on, ravens flew back and forth, carrying half-truths and bits of news that left Winterfell's inhabitants on edge. Some said the king had died in a hunting accident, others that Cersei Lannister was moving swiftly to secure the throne for her son Joffrey. Rumors began to swirl that Ned Stark had discovered a dark secret about Joffrey's parentage and was planning to reveal it. Then came the dire report that Ned had been arrested for treason. Winterfell reeled. Robb paced the halls, summoning bannermen with a clenched jaw and fiery determination, while Bran tried desperately to make sense of it. Where was Littlefinger in all this? Had he played a hand in condemning Ned? Or was he still feigning loyalty, waiting for the perfect moment? One grim twilight, after a day spent hearing the pleas of lesser lords and common folk who came to Winterfell for guidance, Robb found Bran alone in the library tower. The single candle on the desk cast flickering shadows on the ancient tomes, the air thick with the smell of dust and parchment. Bran had been reading an old chronicle of past kings, but his mind drifted. He gazed at Robb's face, searching for hope there, but found only resolve and worry. "We're calling the banners," Robb said quietly. "I'm marching south. Father needs our help, and if the Lannisters are holding him, we can't just stand by." Nenda said, Bran felt his heart sink. "Then it's war?" he asked, trembling. Robb's gaze flickered. "If they won't release Father, it seems so. But I'll do everything I can to avoid bloodshed if possible." Bran swallowed hard. He wanted to speak of the vision, of Littlefinger's betrayal. But Robb had enough burdens on his shoulders. Yet if he did not speak, might it doom their father? "Robb," he began softly, "before Father left, I warned him about Littlefinger. I saw something awful in a dream or a vision. A dagger at Father's throat. He promised to be careful. But what if that's what led to all this? Maybe Baelish helped turn the queen against him." "Mount Sir." Robb's brows drew together. "I've heard the name. He's master of coin on the small council. Catelyn Tully knew him in her youth, or so I understand. But if Father suspected him, would he not have been guarded?" Bran nodded, tears pressing at the corners of his eyes. "I thought so. But it seems Father believed Baelish was helping him gather proof about the Lannisters. Maybe that was his plan all along. To lure Father into a trap." "Dear Ro." Robb slammed a fist down on the edge of the desk. "Then we'll see this Littlefinger pay. Him and every Lannister who dared to harm our father." He took a breath, trying to calm himself, and laid a hand gently on Bran's shoulder. "I'm sorry, Bran. This must be tearing you apart. But I promise you, I won't let them keep Father. War or not, I'll bring him back." Bran's chest felt tight. He hated his helplessness, hated that all he had was a dream and no way to prove it. "Be careful," he whispered. "Down there, it's not just swords and battles. There are plots and schemes." "I don't want to lose you too." Robb nodded solemnly. "I'll be careful. I'll take wise counsel, and I'll rely on the lords who know war and politics. I won't walk into any trap. You'll stay here, under Maester Luwin's care, safe in our home. That's what Father would want." Bran understood. He resented it, but he knew traveling south in his condition would be more a hindrance than a help. So he only nodded, and Robb left him alone in the flickering gloom of the library. The cold stone walls pressed in, and for a moment, Bran wished desperately for a life where none of this was happening, where his family was whole, and the biggest worry was whether or not I'd ever climb again. A week later, the courtyard thundered with hooves as the armies of the north assembled and began marching south. Robb led them, clad in armor that still seemed too large for him. He had the look of a lord despite his youth, shoulders squared, jaw set. He said his farewells to Bran and Rickon, and then he was gone, banners streaming behind him like a wave of silver and gray. Winterfell felt emptier than ever. A castle of ghosts. The nights were still, the shadows long, and every rumor from the south arrived like a dagger to the heart. It was in that silence that Bran had another vision, more fragmented than before, but just as unsettling. He saw Ned Stark in a dimly lit room, his leg in bandages, pain etched on his features. Littlefinger stood beside him, whispering something that made Ned's eyes widen in outrage. Then the image shifted, and Bran was soaring above a crowd gathered in a courtyard that smelled of fear and sweat. He saw tall battlements, the looming shape of the Red Keep. He saw steel glinting in the sunlight. There were shouts, a cry, and Sansa's face twisting in horror. The vision ended as abruptly as it began, leaving Bran shaking in his bed, tears on his cheeks. He gasped for breath, trying to hold onto the scene, to glean any detail that might help him save his father. But the images were maddeningly vague. He tried telling Maester Luwin about it, describing every flicker of color, every echo of sound he remembered. Luwin listened gravely, placing a comforting hand on Bran's. "We have sent word to Robb, letting him know that time may be short," the Maester said. "We can only hope he arrives before any final sentence is passed on your father. We know the Queen will stop at nothing to protect her son's claim to the throne." Bran nodded, silent tears sliding down his face. He was terrified that the next raven would bring news of Ned's execution, or that no raven would come at all. He felt powerless, and so terribly distant from the center of it all. The old gods were silent, or perhaps only speaking in riddles he couldn't decipher. He found himself cursing the day he climbed that tower and fell, cursing the inability to help that had followed. Hodor tried to cheer him with a friendly smile and a pat on the head, but Bran's heart was too heavy for such small comforts. The turning point came on a bleak, stormy afternoon when a raven arrived, drenched and exhausted, its wings trembling. Bran was summoned to the Great Hall, where the Maester and what remained of Winterfell's council were gathered. The parchment was sealed in a way none of them recognized, but it was addressed to Bran Stark. Maester Luwin's eyes flicked over it, uncertainly before he handed it to Bran. Bran's fingers shook as he opened it. The writing was spidery, but the words were clear enough. They planned to make an example of him. The boy king is too proud to show mercy. Do not expect the Lannisters or the Queen to intervene. If your brother does not reach the city soon, your father's life is forfeit. I have done what I can. Petyr Baelish. Bran's breath caught in his throat. The signature was there, as if mocking him. Had Littlefinger written this to toy with the Starks? Or was this genuine aid, a final piece of help from a man who played all sides? The words were dripping with a sense of finality, as though events had reached their climax. They plan to make an example of him, Bran repeated in a hollow voice. That means they'll kill him. His voice cracked with the realization. Tears glistened in the Maester's eyes, and the men around him looked grim. One of the older knights slammed a gauntleted fist against the table. "By the gods," he hissed. "We can only pray that Robb's host is swift enough to prevent this travesty." Bran couldn't speak. The note might be a lie, or it might be the truth. Either way, it was the darkest news he'd received. Littlefinger's motivations remained an enigma. Was he truly giving them a warning out of some twisted loyalty or pity? Or was he simply ensuring that if Ned fell, the blame would not land on him? Perhaps it was a final taunt, a confirmation that no matter how Ned tried, he could not escape the cunning webs of King's Landing. Bran was ushered back to his chamber, where he curled up beneath the thick fur blankets on his bed, trembling from more than just the cold. He thought of the times he had watched Ned preside over matters of justice, the times he had carried Bran on his shoulders during festivals, the quiet moments in the courtyard when father and son shot arrows side by side. The agony of possibly losing him was so profound that Bran felt as though he might shatter into 1,000 pieces. Night fell, and the castle slept uneasily. An icy wind howled over the battlements, rattling shutters and singing a mournful song in the courtyard. Bran slipped from his bed, ignoring the aches in his legs. He dragged himself into the wheelchair and motioned for Hodor to push him to the godswood one more time. There, beneath the heart tree, he pressed his palm against the trunk, as if it might be a portal to a kinder world. He closed his eyes and murmured a plea to the old gods for mercy, for a miracle, for something to turn the tide. The darkness behind his eyelids swirled, and for an instant he saw Ned Stark's face again, weary and resolute. He wore simple attire, no finery of a lord, and his hands were bound before him. There was a crowd watching, some jeering, some silent in sympathy. Joffrey Baratheon loomed above, his boyish face twisted with arrogance, a sword in someone's hands. In the vision, Ned turned his head slightly, as if searching for an ally in the throng. But all he found was Littlefinger standing off to the side, arms folded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Bran tried to scream, but his voice made no sound in the silent dream. His father was forced to his knees. The sword rose. Then Bran opened his eyes with a gasp, the vision gone. The godswood was silent and still around him, the heart tree unmoving. Hodor's breath plumed in the cold air. Bran could do nothing but stare up at the pale moon, tears glinting on his cheeks. He felt certain the next raven would bring the final blow. The news that the father he had tried so desperately to protect had been lost to the treachery of King's Landing. He had given Ned a warning before he left Winterfell, but even the best of intentions might fail when pitted against the labyrinth of power players in the capital. The slow fall of a single leaf from the heart tree's crimson canopy reminded him how fragile hope could be. And so he waited, in that hush of the northern night, praying for a dawn that might never come. Bran remained in the godswood well after the moon had risen, the night cloaking him in a hush broken only by the faint murmur of leaves in the breeze. He could not shake the last glimpse of that vision. His father on his knees, steel rising and Littlefinger's half-smile lingering in the background like a stain. 1,000 questions churned in Bran's mind. Could there still be time for his warning to matter? Would Robb's army reach the city before Joffrey and the Lannisters sealed their triumph? Every passing moment seemed to drag the Starks closer to calamity. At length, he signaled to Hodor with a trembling hand. The big stable boy, though hardly a boy, bent down to lift him, handling Bran with a gentle firmness that belied his size. They returned inside by torchlight, the castle corridors empty and echoing with their footsteps. Maester Luwin waited in the antechamber outside Bran's room, his arms folded in his robes, face etched with concern. Bran looked up at him but did not speak. He felt certain no words could quell the dread unspooling in his heart. At last, Luwin placed a steady hand on Bran's arm and softly guided him to his bed. That night, slumber eluded him. The darkness beyond the narrow window felt impenetrable. Several times he closed his eyes, only to open them again with the memory of the courtyard in King's Landing. It did not matter that he had never set foot there. His dreams conjured every detail in merciless clarity. He could almost smell the dust, the hot southern sun on stone, the press of a crowd hungry for spectacle. In those moments, the entire world outside Winterfell became alive in his mind, and it was all the more terrifying for feeling so real. When dawnlight finally crept over the battlements, he roused himself from a fitful doze. The castle routine stirred to life. Servants bustled about with bread trays and steaming kettles. Stable hands led the horses to water, and men-at-arms on the night watch trudged back to their quarters. Bran asked Hodor to bring him to the hall where the few remaining castle folk would break their fast. He found Rickon there, messy-haired and scowling at the bread in front of him. Too young to understand the full weight of recent events, but old enough to sense the tension. When Rickon saw Bran, he offered a half-hearted wave, his lower lip quivering. "Is father coming home soon?" Rickon asked, voice small. Bran swallowed. "He might. Robb is going to get him." Rickon scrunched his face. "But when?" "I don't know," Bran whispered. He forced himself to take a piece of bread, though it felt like ashes in his mouth. He was about to reach for some milk when a messenger entered, his boots stirring the rushes on the floor. The young man looked weary from travel and inclined his head toward Bran. "Pardon, my lord," he said quietly, conscious of Rickon's presence. "Another raven just arrived. Maester Luwin wanted you to have it straight away." Bran felt a jolt of mingled hope and dread. He set the bread aside and nodded at Hodor to wheel him closer. The parchment was sealed simply, with no house sigil. Heart pounding, he broke the wax. The message was short. They have taken him from the dungeons. They will have him confess or die at midday. It was unsigned, but a single mocking flourish at the end suggested a certain author. Bran's blood went cold. He looked at Rickon's wide eyes and found himself at a loss for words. Without thinking, he beckoned the messenger and asked him to carry him to Maester Luwin at once. They found the Maester in his solar, an array of scrolls spread across a table that had once held maps and stargazing charts. Now is a makeshift war room, with lines drawn to represent the roads leading south and small wooden carvings representing the northern houses that had rallied to rob. Maester Luwin took the parchment from Bran's trembling hand, read it with pursed lips, and let out a slow, pained sigh. "This suggests the end is near," he said grimly. "The Lannisters and their allies seek to make your father kneel to the boy king's will. If he does not give them what they want, we fear the worst. And even if he yields, the outcome is uncertain." 9. Bran's thoughts raced. He recalled glimpses of his father's unyielding honor. How many times Ned Stark had told him that a man must keep his word, that the truth is not easily silenced. But these were not the northern fields of justice. King's Landing was a viper's nest. Perhaps father would feel compelled to bend, to say whatever the new king demanded in order to spare Sansa, Arya, or himself. Bran hated the idea, but the alternative was unthinkable. "Is there nothing we can do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Luwin shook his head sadly. "Not from here, my boy. The ravens have been sent. Robb is already on the march. There is no faster way." Bran stared at the table, at the wooden carvings. He wanted to fling them aside, to cry out at the injustice. Instead, he only managed a faint nod. The Maester gently squeezed Bran's shoulder and then turned away to pen another urgent message, though Bran guessed it would be futile. The distances were too great, and the hours too few. By the time Robb reached the Riverlands, events in the capital would already have played out. He left Luwin to his desperate letters and signaled to Hodor. It was growing more difficult to keep a brave face for Rickon, so he decided to pass the morning in the Godswood again. He felt as though the Heart Tree were the only place that truly understood his dread. The courtyard was quiet as they went, the sky overcast, and the wind full of a chill that spoke of the coming winter. They rolled across the wooden bridge into the solitude of red leaves and murky waters. And there Bran closed his eyes, trying to will a glimpse of what was to come. Perhaps if he could see a path out of this, he could guide someone, anyone, to prevent the horror from unfolding. But his mind was a blur of fragments, and no clear vision came. Instead, he found himself remembering once again the scene of steel, the hush of a crowd, and the finality in the air. It felt like fate. Yet the old gods had not truly abandoned him, had they? If they gave him these glimpses, then they must mean for him to act. But how? Time slipped away in that hush, and soon the sun had climbed too high for Bran's liking. He knew that many leagues south, midday would come all too soon for his father. With a grim nod to Hodor, he left the Godswood behind and returned to the Great Hall, where the few remaining household knights still loyal to House Stark had gathered in uneasy clusters. They stood when Bran entered, regarding him with a solemn respect he had never felt before. Perhaps they had always seen him as a curious boy, crippled after a fall, overshadowed by his brothers. But now, with the fate of Ned Stark uncertain, Bran felt them looking to him for answers he did not have. He watched them with silent gratitude, aware that they were preparing for any word from the south, whether it be to rally in defense or to seal the gates if enemies appeared at Winterfell's doorstep. The tension was near palpable. Even the hounds in the kennels barked restlessly at intervals, as though sensing the castle's turmoil. The hours dragged on. Bran could scarcely recall what it felt like to pass the day in carefree pursuits. By the time the shadows grew long across the courtyard, the color of the sky had turned a bruised purple, thick with the promise of rain. Standing by a window in the upper corridor, Bran gazed out over the gates. No sign of any messenger returning at speed, no flash of hope. At last, near nightfall, footsteps sounded behind him. He turned to see Maester Luwin, and a single guardsman approaching. The maester's face bore a grave set that Bran had come to dread. "There is news," the maester said softly. "A rider arrived, claiming to bear word from King's Landing. We had him fed and given new clothes for the chill, and he will speak to you in the hall." "Niano, Deposer." Bran's heart pounded. He knew not whether to long for or fear the words that would come. "Very well," he said, keeping his voice steady for the sake of pride. "Let's hear him." They proceeded downstairs, Hodor's heavy footsteps echoing. The great hall was lit by torches, their flames dancing in the currents of air that slipped through the cracks in the walls. At the far end stood a traveler with a lean, weather-beaten face, clad in rough garb that had seen better days. He bowed stiffly when he saw Bran. "My lord," he said, his voice echoing, "I bring tidings from the capital. Dark tidings, I fear. Lord Eddard Stark has been executed for treason by order of King Joffrey." Bran's stomach lurched, and the hall seemed to reel. There were muffled gasps from those present. A table was overturned by one of the knights in sudden fury, and someone cursed the Lannisters in a ragged voice. Bran could not speak. It was as though his lungs had seized up, refusing him the breath to voice his anguish. The traveler's words repeated in his mind like a hammer driving nails into his heart. At last he forced himself to whisper, "Are you certain?" The messenger nodded, eyes downcast. "I am. I saw it with my own eyes." They paraded him before the crowd in the Baelor's Sept courtyard. They said he confessed to plotting against the crown, but I heard tell he was only doing it to save your sister. Then Joffrey called for his head. Sir Lyn Payne swung the sword. Bran felt as though the stone floor opened beneath him. He had warned his father. He had tried. Ned Stark had taken that warning seriously, and yet none of it mattered. The city had devoured his father's honor. Or, if the rumors were to be believed, father had thrown away his pride at the last moment, only to be repaid with treachery. A wave of hot tears threatened to spill from Bran's eyes, but he held them back, mindful of the onlookers who needed him to be strong. The vision he had seen, the one he had feared, had come to pass. Behind Bran, the hall erupted into commotion, voices rising in grief and rage. More than a few soldiers cursed the boy king. Others pounded the wooden tables with fists and scabbards. Maester Luwin pressed a trembling hand to his mouth, eyes glistening as he whispered, "Oh gods, Ned." Bran stared at the messenger's drawn face. "And Petyr Baelish?" he asked, though his voice wobbled. "Do you know if he had a hand in this?" The man hesitated, looking uneasy. "There are many rumors. Some say Lord Baelish pledged to help your father, but at the final moment he turned away. Others swear he tried to intervene or at least offered false hope. It's all so muddled. All I know for certain is that in the end, Lord Stark was alone on that stage." "Never messeter. Neri." Bran closed his eyes. Then, it was done. The warning had come too late, or had never been enough. Littlefinger had slithered through it all, guiding Ned to some false sense of security, only to abandon him when the moment was most dire. Bran's chest ached with raw grief. He did not weep in front of the hall, but his silence spoke louder than any cry. "Thank you," he managed to say to the messenger, though the words were hollow. "Rest and eat what we have. We are in your debt." The man bowed again, voice subdued. "I'm sorry, my lord." Then he retreated, escorted by a guard. In his wake, a hush settled upon the great hall. A hush broken by sobs and frustrated oaths. The torches flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Bran could hardly bear it. He turned, motioning for Hodor to wheel him out of the hall. Some of the men followed him with their eyes, but none dared speak to him in that moment. He headed to the library tower, wanting solitude. The corridor felt colder than before, and every step Hodor took seemed too loud. Once inside the library, Bran gestured for Hodor to leave him. The big man hesitated but obeyed, stepping outside to stand guard. The flickering candlelight illuminated rows of old tomes and dusty scrolls. Here, the shadows had always felt comforting. A place of study, of calm. Now, they only felt oppressive. Bran stared at the shelves without seeing them. He tried to imagine life without his father's steady hand. Tried to picture Robb returning from his campaign only to learn that he was now the Lord of Winterfell, fatherless. Sansa, somewhere in the south, all alone or held captive by the Lannisters, grieving. Arya lost, wherever she might be. Rickon, too young to understand the depth of this tragedy. And what of Catelyn Tully Stark? She had gone to the Riverlands to rally support. The blow of Ned's death would shatter her. He thought of all that had led to this moment. Catelyn's capture of Tyrion Lannister on the King's Road. Ned's appointment as Hand of the King. The swirl of secrets surrounding King Robert's heirs, and the cunning glances of pettier Baelish. Through it all, Ned had remained steadfast in his duty and honor. And yet, in the final act, that city, that southern realm, had proven that honor alone was not enough to shield a man from treachery. A surge of bitterness rose within Bran. He had tried to warn him, had told him plainly. Beware of Littlefinger. But fate marched on with unyielding steps. Perhaps the seeds were sown before even that. Perhaps no warning could undo the entangled webs that the Lannisters and Petyr Baelish wove. Still, a part of Bran felt guilt. An irrational guilt, he knew, but it gnawed at him all the same. If only he had seen more, known more, done more. Hours seemed to slip by in that lonely place. Eventually, the small candle stub sputtered out, leaving the library in near darkness. Bran's eyes burned from unshed tears and his mind whirled. At some point he heard Hodor's worried call. A soft Hodor. From behind the door. Bran did not respond. In the silence that followed, he felt a momentary pang of regret for leaving Hodor in confusion, but he could not bring himself to speak. Words were ashes now. At last, near midnight, Maester Luwin came searching. The old man's eyes were rimmed with sorrow, and he carried a new candle. Its light revealed Bran, hunched in his wheelchair, staring at nothing. "My boy," Luwin said softly, setting the candle on a nearby table. "You cannot be alone in such grief. The castle is in mourning. We need each other." Bran swallowed hard, blinking back tears that finally spilled over. "I can't bear it," he whispered. "All I see when I close my eyes is that image, the sword. I tried to stop it." Luwin moved closer and placed a hand on Bran's shoulder. "I know. We all did what we thought we could. Sometimes the forces at play are beyond mortal hands. You mustn't blame yourself." But the ache in Bran's chest felt unrelenting. He let out a trembling breath. What happens now? Robb was marching to bargain, or to fight if he had to. But with father gone, there's nothing left to bargain for. Your father's death changes everything. The men down south will see it as an open act of aggression from the crown. The great Jon, Roose Bolton, and all the northern lords rallied because they believed in Ned Stark's just cause. Luwin paused, pressing his lips together. "I fear they will be thirsting for retribution now." Bran bit his lip until he tasted blood. War thought. A great war, fueled by the wrath of the North. He pictured the waves of steel, surging across the Trident, clashing with Lannister forces. More death, more heartbreak. The notion made him feel ill, but he couldn't deny it. If the Lannisters had chosen to strike at House Stark's lord, they had sparked a fury that would not be easily extinguished. Luwin's hand on Bran's shoulder tightened slightly. "But you must endure. You are still a Stark, and Winterfell stands. We will carry on in your father's memory. The people need hope." Hope felt like a lie, but Bran nodded anyway, trying to gather what remained of his composure. I need to see Rickon," he said at last, voice hoarse. They found the youngest Stark in the company of the direwolves. Shaggydog and Summer lingered in the corner of the old kennel yard, sniffing the night air, as if they too sensed the shift in the family's fate. Rickon sat on a low stool, face streaked with tears, burying his hand in Shaggydog's black fur. When Bran approached, Summer patted over quietly, pressing its massive head against Bran's leg. The wolf's eyes glowed in the moonlight, and Bran felt a strange stirring in his heart. He stroked Summer's thick coat, tears finally slipping down his cheeks. "He's gone, isn't he?" Rickon said, glancing at Bran with red-rimmed eyes. "I saw him in my dream. I saw the heads on the walls. I saw Father's face." Bran's breath caught. The old gods did not limit their visions to him alone, it seemed. But he could offer Rickon no comfort beyond the warmth of a brother's presence. Hodor lingered nearby, watching the pair with an expression of sad helplessness. Maester Luwin, leaning on his staff, quietly wiped his own tears. At length, Bran took Rickon's hand. "Yes, he's gone. But we're still here. Robb will come home when he can. And Mother, until then we must be strong." Even as he spoke, the words sounded hollow. But it was all he had. Rickon nodded, burying his face in Shaggy Dog's fur. The next day dawned gray and listless. The news had spread through the castle and the surrounding lands. Lord Eddard Stark was dead. Mourning hung over Winterfell like a pall. The blacksmith hammered in listless, unenthusiastic strokes, producing only the simplest of repairs. The kitchens prepared sparse meals, lacking their usual vigor for seasoning and care. Even the ravens seemed quieter, as though they too felt the sadness that permeated the keep. The only spark of life came from the men-at-arms who took to the training yard, brandishing swords and spears. Their movements were sharper than ever, anger fueling every thrust. Perhaps they imagined each straw dummy as the Lannister host, or the Boy King himself. Bran watched them from a window, feeling that same anger simmer inside him. But he was a child in a chair, and there was little he could do but watch. That evening, another rider arrived, this one bearing a letter from Robb's encampment. The Stark bannermen had reached the Twins, where Lord Walder Frey controlled the crossing. The letter was meant for Maester Luwin's eyes, but Bran insisted on hearing every detail. Luwin read it aloud in the quiet of the solar, his voice subdued. "Word of Father's death reached us at the neck. Our outriders confirmed it. The men are furious. Some demand immediate battle with the Lannisters. I have promised them swift action, but the crossing of the Twins must be negotiated. The Freys are a wary lot, and they know our need is great. They will ask for concessions, perhaps even marriage pacts. I cannot say how long the delay will be. But know this, I will make them pay for what they did to our father. We will not rest until Ned Stark's honor is avenged." The letter bore Robb's signature. Bran listened, torn between pride at Robb's, resolve and horror at the bloodshed that loomed. He felt so far away from it all, as though the north he inhabited were a different world. Still, he could not help but recall the night he'd spoken with Ned in the solar, begging him to beware of Littlefinger. The memory stung. When Luwin finished, he looked to Bran with expectation. "Shall we send a reply, my lord?" Bran paused. The word felt strange. His father was gone. Robb was off to war, and Bran was left to speak for Winterfell. It felt as if a great stone weight pressed on his chest. "Tell him," he faltered, searching for the right words. "Tell him our hearts are with him. Tell him we wait for his return. And tell him he has our blessing. Whatever he must do to keep the North safe, we trust him." His voice shook at the end, but the maester did not question it. "A wise answer, my lord." Luwin set to writing at once. Bran looked down at his own hands, noticing how small they seemed. Once, he had dreamed of being a knight, galloping across meadows, challenging all foes. Now he was a cripple, pinned to Winterfell while his brother fought a war he could only imagine. His father's death weighed on him like an iron chain. In the days that followed, the castle settled into a somber routine. Letters arrived with grim updates about the Riverlands, the gathering forces, and the Lannisters' swift response. Tales of burnt villages and ravaged fields trickled north, fueling the anger of every northern man who could lift a sword. They spoke in hushed tones of Tywin Lannister's cruelty, of Jaime Lannister capturing Riverrun, and of the cunning that House Lannister wielded like a blade. In the nights, thunder rolled ominously across the dark sky, as though even the heavens braced for a storm of swords. Winterfell itself never felt more hollow. The younger lords who remained looked to Bran with new deference, calling him "my lord" at every turn, though he had no illusions of authority. He listened to their counsel, gave them permission to follow Robb's summons, and gradually the castle's population dwindled. Men rode south in small groups, determined to join the young wolf's cause. Bran watched them depart, proud yet fearful. Each time, he prayed they would return triumphant, rather than broken by war. Between these sorrowful departures, he drifted to the Godswood, seeking comfort from the ancient weirwood's silent presence. Summer often padded beside him, sniffing at fallen leaves and letting out low, uneasy growls when the wind changed direction. Bran would place a hand on the heart tree's trunk, close his eyes, and attempt to calm his restless mind. Sometimes he thought he felt Ned's spirit lingering there, a faint echo of his father's deep voice, but it was only the rustle of leaves in the breeze. One late afternoon, he sat by the black pool at the center of the Godswood, the reflection of the weirwood's red leaves rippling in the water. Summer lay at his side, head on her paws. Bran let the hush envelop him, listening to his own breath. Then, very faintly, a familiar sensation crept over him, the subtle swirl of colors and shadows that sometimes preceded his visions. This time, he did not resist. He let the feeling guide him. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw King's Landing again, but not the courtyard where his father died. Instead, he found himself in a long hallway lit by torches. Petyr Baelish walked there, steps silent, a smirk on his lips. Behind him trailed a group of men Bran did not recognize, men with cruel eyes and quick hands resting on hidden blades. They spoke in hushed tones of future alliances, of plans to manipulate the new king. Then the scene flickered, replaced by a glimpse of Sansa in a room, tears streaking her cheeks, while Littlefinger whispered something to her that made her recoil. Another flicker, and Bran saw the Iron Throne, jagged and imposing, with Joffrey perched upon it as if it were the seat of the gods. Littlefinger stood at his side, bowing with feigned humility. The vision ended. Bran's eyes snapped open, breath hitching. He glanced at Summer, who gave a questioning look. This time, the glimpse had not been about Ned's death. It was about what came after. Littlefinger was weaving new webs around the throne, whispering to Joffrey, to Sansa, to others. A wave of anger and revulsion swept Bran. If only his father had seen the man's true nature before it was too late. If only the realm could see it now. But the realm was blind, enthralled or frightened by the power of the Iron Throne. Night fell as he sat there, pondering the meaning of that vision. Eventually, hunger and the chill drove him back inside, where old Nan tried to coax him into eating. She patted his arm, muttering half to herself that the Starks had endured dark times before, and they would endure this too. Bran listened dully, letting the old woman's soft voice fill the space where his father's might have been. The following day, a raven arrived bearing a missive from Catelyn Stark. She wrote of heartbreak and fury, of her alliance with Robb, and of her determination to see justice done. The war would carry them forward, she wrote, but their greatest worry was Sansa, still effectively a prisoner at court, and Arya, who had vanished in the chaos. Catelyn begged Bran to keep hope, to look after Rickon, and to care for Winterfell in their absence. Bran read her words, tears sliding down his cheeks. He could almost hear her voice, gentle but steeled by sorrow. He wrote back dutifully, explaining the quiet gloom of Winterfell, Rickon's confusion, his own nightmares. He ended with a promise that the North would stand behind Robb until justice was done. The letter felt small in his hands, insignificant compared to the scale of the tragedy, but it was all he could offer. After sealing the parchment, he wheeled himself to the tower where the ravens were kept. Maester Luwine assisted him up the final steps, guiding the wheelchair carefully. The ravenry smelled of feathers and droppings, a cramped, high place with wooden beams and perches. Bran handed the letter to Luwine, who attached it to a dark feathered bird with sure, practiced movements. The bird let out a protesting caw, then flapped into the air, disappearing into the gray sky. Bran watched it go, imagining the small figure crossing leagues of hostile territory, carrying the last vestiges of hope between mother and son. That night, the wind howled, and the cold rain lashed the roofs of Winterfell. Bran found no rest in his bed, so he rose and had Hodor bring him to the great hall. There, the hearth fire cast dancing shadows, and the thick walls muffled the storm's fury. Only a handful of souls lingered, guards on late watch, a cook cleaning up, and a pair of direwolves curled near the warm stones. He positioned himself close to the fire and stared into the flames, letting the heat wash over him. In the shifting embers, he almost thought he saw glimpses of the direwolf sigil burning bright, snapping at the Lion of Lannister. But it was only the play of light and shadow. A memory surfaced, unbidden, of his father explaining the meaning of house words. "Winter is coming," Ned Stark had often said. A reminder that the good times could not last forever, that hardships lay ahead. How prescient those words felt now. Winter was coming in more ways than one. Not just the literal cold, but also the creeping darkness of war and betrayal sweeping through the land. Bran closed his eyes, picturing Ned's solemn face as he spoke those words. If only there had been more time. He did not know how long he stayed there, half dozing, haunted by fleeting dreams. When morning arrived, the storm had passed, leaving the sky a pale, watery blue. The courtyard glistened with puddles, and the chill in the air was sharper than ever. Bran roused himself to discover that a small party of riders had arrived at dawn. Men from the mountain clans, come down from the high passes with news. They claimed they sought the Starks' guidance, for rumors of Ned's death had spread even to the stony peaks. Bran tried to greet them with dignity in the great hall, though he felt dwarfed by their presence. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard, spoke in a booming voice, offering condolences and grim determination to follow Robb's call if it meant avenging Ned Stark. Bran thanked them, his voice still trembling with sorrow, and the clan chieftain nodded with respect. In that moment, Bran felt the gravity of his new role as a Stark in Winterfell. The entire North seethed with anger, rallying to the name they revered. A boy might not stem that tide, but he could guide its course. He felt an ember of resolve spark within him. Ned was gone, but the struggle was not. If there was any way to shield his family, or to thwart the cunning behind his father's death, Bran would not hesitate. Even if his body was confined to this chair, he had the old gods, his visions, and the loyalty of his people. Days turned into weeks, with more clansmen arriving, more lords departing to join Robb's army. Bran observed their comings and goings, receiving them as best he could from the high seat in the great hall that once belonged to his father. He found the seat too large, the stone arms cold, but he tried not to shrink from that responsibility. He wore thick furs, a reminder of the Stark name and the land he embodied. Rickon sat at times on the dais beside him, a frightened boy clinging to Shaggy Dog's sleek fur, but even Rickon learned to hold his head a little higher when the men bowed. One crisp morning, as Bran wrestled with a letter from Roose Bolton, filled with talk of troop movements and demands, he felt a presence at his side. He turned to see old Nan, her wrinkled face set in an expression of determination. She carried a wooden box in her gnarled hands. Without a word, she opened it to reveal a length of wolf's head embroidery, carefully stitched in black and gray. "Your father started this tapestry many a year ago," she rasped, her voice cracked with age. "He'd do a few stitches when time allowed. After your fall, he said he wanted to finish it for you. But he never did with all the troubles." Bran's heart clenched as he gently touched the unfinished tapestry. The direwolf shape stood proudly at the center, its eyes red thread, but the background was incomplete. Perhaps Ned had meant to weave in scenes of Winterfell's towers, or perhaps something else entirely. Now it would never be finished. Bran stared at the needle, still threaded with dark gray, waiting. For a moment, he considered taking it up himself, carrying on his father's last peaceful pastime. But his fingers felt clumsy, and the sorrow was too raw. "Keep it safe," he whispered, handing it back to old Nan. The elderly woman nodded, tears in her eyes. She closed the wooden box and slipped away, her soft footsteps scraping on the stone floor. In the quiet that followed, Bran heard a distant howling of wind, a sound that might have been summer echoing it in the courtyard. He exhaled a slow breath, letting the weight of memory and regret settle in his chest. The ghosts of the past would haunt Winterfell for a long time, and perhaps always. Yet the living remained, and the duty of the living was to fight for a future, even if that future seemed dark and uncertain now. He looked up at the vast vaulting rafters of the great hall, recalling the time he had raced across them in a moment of daring climbing where no one else dared. That was a different Bran. But perhaps some part of that brave boy still lived inside him. He would need that courage in the days and weeks to come, because the shadow of war loomed, and the North would soon be tested as never before. By evening, another raven arrived, carrying the news that Robb had secured the crossing at the Twins through negotiation with Walder Frey. The details were murky. There was talk of a marriage alliance for one of the Stark children. Which one, the letter did not say. But the main point was that Robb's host would soon engage the Lannisters in open battle. Bran could almost hear the distant thunder of hooves and the clang of steel as he read. He closed his eyes and whispered a soft prayer to the old gods that Robb would be victorious, that the men who followed him would not share Ned Stark's fate. In the following days, the tension in Winterfell became suffocating. Everyone seemed to await word of the conflict that would decide the North's future. Bran found his nightmares intensifying, visions of crows on battlefields, of rivers running red, of the mocking eyes of Littlefinger lurking behind each twist of fate. Sometimes he sensed a new presence in his dreams, something vast and ancient, stirring beneath the roots of the weirwood trees. But he never remembered it clearly upon waking. One dawn, a horn's call shattered the stillness. Bran, jostled awake, hurried to the ramparts in his chair, Hodor pushing him at a brisk pace. The guard on duty pointed at a small party of riders emerging from the far tree line. They carried no flags, but the lead rider had something that shone dully in the morning sun. As they drew closer, Bran discerned what it was. A battered helm shaped like a wolf's head, one of Robb's outridders. The men were hastily admitted, their mounts lathered in sweat from hard riding. Bran ordered them brought to the great hall. There, the outrider, a grizzled man with scars across his cheeks, bowed low to Bran before he spoke. "My lord, I come from the banks of the Whispering Wood," he rasped. "Your brother, Robb Stark, has met the forces of Sir Jaime Lannister in battle, and prevailed." A gasp rippled through those assembled. Bran felt his pulse leap. "Robb won?" he asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Aye," the man said. "We drew the King's lair into a trap. Catelyn Stark was there as well. Jaime Lannister is captured. Many of his men are dead or scattered. Your brother is hailed as the young wolf. They say even the direwolves soared through the fight like spirits of vengeance." There went South Dacia. Bran's relief coursed through him, followed by a bitter edge. His father was still gone, but at least the Lannisters had not triumphed unopposed. "What of the rest of the war?" he pressed. "Do we know anything of Tywin Lannister's host?" The outrider grimaced. "They remain at large, my lord. But Robb's victory sends a strong message. All the North hears it. The time of mourning may soon turn to the time of retribution." "Then there's..." Bran lowered his eyes. "Then the fighting isn't over. Not by a long sight," the outrider said quietly. "But this is a victory, and the men rejoice. They say the young wolf fights with a fury that can only come from House Stark's blood. Some credit your father's spirit for guiding him." At those words, tears pricked Bran's eyes again. He managed a solemn nod, and the hall stirred with a cautious hope. The outrider's news spread fast, lifting the weight of despair, if only by a fraction. A hum of excitement buzzed along the corridors, and more men prepared to ride south to join Robb, eager to taste victory. Bran found himself alone again that evening, seated by the fireplace. He thought of the outrider's words, of Robb's triumph, and of the final moments of his father's life. Vengeance was a cold comfort, yet it fueled the North's resolve. If Ned Stark could not be saved, perhaps his killers, and those who stood by in betrayal, would face the wrath of House Stark. He closed his eyes, letting the crackle of fire lull him into a half-dream. Once more, he imagined a raven's eye view over King's Landing, drifting through high windows into the throne room. Littlefinger was there near the boy king, wearing the same sly smirk. But in this dream, the Red Keep's walls were beset by howling wolves, their eyes gleaming in the gloom. The city quaked underfoot, and the Iron Throne itself trembled as if it might collapse. Bran watched, breath suspended, as the image faded into blackness. He did not know what it meant, perhaps only that a tide of retribution was coming, a tide that might one day wash over every cunning betrayal. For now, All he could do was hold on to that vision. Hold on to the faint belief that the North remembered its wrongs, and that it would not rest until justice was meted out. As the fire crackled low, Bran whispered a final good night to the silent stones of Winterfell, to the spirit of his father who might yet linger in the watchful shadows. The hour was late, and his bones ached with exhaustion. But for once, as he let his eyelids droop, he felt a spark of resolve. Littlefinger had played his part in Ned's fall, and the Lannisters thought they could crush House Stark underfoot. The South might have claimed Ned Stark's life, but his legacy and his children remained. Winter was coming, and with it, the promise that those who had twisted the truth would one day reckon with the fury of the North. Bran slept fitfully that night, haunted by the echoes of the Outriders' news that Robb had captured the Kingslayer, that a great victory had been won at the Whispering Wood. On any other day, that triumph might have lit a glorious flame of hope in his heart, but now it flickered low beneath the immense weight of his father's loss. Sleep came in disjointed fragments, studded with nightmares. He saw Ned's face, stern and gentle, changing into the stark image of an execution block. He saw Littlefinger's grin lingering in the shadows behind the Iron Throne. Ravens loomed overhead, black wings beating like a thundercloud. Yet they brought no message of rescue, only the rasp of sorrow. When morning finally roused him, he found the sky over Winterfell a soft gray. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, but at least the air felt dry. Autumn's chill seeped through the stones of his chamber, and as Hodor helped him dress in warm furs, he could see his breath misting in the dim candlelight. Hodor uttered his name quietly, as if concerned. Bran nodded to show he was all right, though he hardly felt so. He was Lord of Winterfell in name now. But that mantle grew heavier with each passing day. He made his way to the great hall, where an unusual company awaited him. The cluster of mountain clan folk, who had sworn to serve House Stark, a few bannermen who had remained behind to guard the seat of the North, and a handful of the older knights too wounded or aged to ride in the field. They stood when Bran entered, and the hush that settled felt almost reverent. He still was not accustomed to that. He took his place at the high seat, which was a wooden chair propped on a dais so he could wheel close. The seat had once felt so large and foreboding, his father's place. Even now, resting against its high back, Bran remembered how Ned had always seemed so at ease, as if the seat were simply another tool of duty. Bran tried to mimic that calm demeanor, though his heart pounded when the men fixed their eyes upon him. Maester Luwin stepped forward with a letter in hand. "More news from the south, my lord," he said. His voice echoed off the rafters. "It has arrived by raven from the twins." Bran inclined his head for Luwin to read it aloud. Robb's words spilled forth. They had crossed the Green Fork after surprising Tywin Lannister's advance guard. But to secure the crossing, Walder Frey had demanded certain oaths, some form of marriage arrangement, though Robb's letter hinted that he had managed to delay specifics. The main army was now converging near River Run. Catelyn Stark had gone to see her dying father, Lord Hoster Tully, and to help secure that stronghold. Her presence lent the cause greater legitimacy among the River Lord. A Lannister army still threatened from the west, but Jaime Lannister remained a captive of the north, a valuable bargaining chip. Bran let out a long breath once Luwin finished. The men in the hall shifted on their feet, murmuring to each other. Some voiced approval that the Kingslayer had been captured. Others worried that Tywin Lannister would retaliate viciously. Above all, an undercurrent of grim satisfaction circulated. Ned Stark's death would not go unanswered. Bran blinked, trying to push away tears. War was a monstrous thing, but he could not deny a small flare of pride for Robb's achievements. "How shall we answer, my lord?" Luwin asked, bowing slightly. "Shall I pen a reply to let them know Winterfell stands firm, and that provisions for the wounded are being prepared?" Bran swallowed. "Yes," he said, mindful of the eyes on him. "Tell Robb that we are gathering supplies and men to send as reinforcements if needed, and that Winterfell is secure. He need not worry about us. We trust his leadership." Even as he spoke the words, he felt a flutter of uncertainty. The castle might be secure for now, but if the war dragged on, who knew what alliances might shift? The men accepted his statement with nods and low murmurs of approval. Slowly, they filed out. The mountain folk, with their curious stares and rough cloaks, offered him solemn nods. They still seemed amazed to find themselves in these halls. Bran watched them depart, feeling a strange sense of kinship. They had come to fight for House Stark, for the memory of the father who was gone. When only Luwin and a couple of knights remained, Bran asked to be taken to the library. The maester obliged, stepping behind Bran's chair and guiding it along the corridor. Hodor followed at a respectful distance, arms swinging. The trip through the winding passages gave Bran time to think. From somewhere high above, he could hear a raven croaking, perhaps the same one that had carried Robb's letter. Rain had not yet returned, but the sky outside was uniformly steel gray, as if teetering on the brink of a storm. In the library's hush, Bran found his usual table, the one near the narrow window that overlooked the courtyard. Luwin lit a candle, then took a seat across from Bran. The shelves around them creaked under the weight of knowledge. Histories of the Seven Kingdoms, genealogies of ancient houses, musty scrolls filled with lore. For a moment, Bran said nothing, simply resting his hands on the table, considering the swirl of emotions inside him. "Maester," he began quietly, "what do you make of these dreams I've been having?" Luwin's face tightened. He folded his arms. "Which dreams, my lord?" he asked gently, though Bran suspected he already knew. Bran explained what had plagued him since Ned's death. Fleeting visions of King's Landing, the Red Keep under a cloak of darkness, sometimes glimpses of Sansa weeping, other times the sly face of Littlefinger drifting in candlelight. "It's like I'm looking through a keyhole," Bran said, voice trembling. "I see only bits and pieces, never the whole scene. But sometimes it feels as if the dream wants to show me something important. Something I could use." Luwin's expression was somber. "I can't deny that the old gods speak in mysteries," he replied slowly. "Yet we must balance these visions with caution. We know your father was undone by treachery, Baelish's and the Lannisters. If the dreams warn you that the man is still weaving his schemes, that is a matter we should heed. But we have little recourse to act from here." Bran felt a wave of frustration. What if it's not just a warning? What if there's something we can do to save Sansa, or to stop Baelish from hurting her, or from sowing more chaos? My father tried to work within the rules of King's Landing, and it cost him everything. But maybe there's a way to strike at Baelish's power. Maybe. Luwin's mouth pressed into a line. "We're far removed from the capital, my boy. And Baelish is rumored to have powerful ties, not just with the crown but with the coin, the brothels, the city watch. He's cunning in ways we can barely fathom." The candle guttered in a faint draft. Bran stared at its flame. "Then let me at least try to see more," he said. "When I sleep, or when I go to the Godswood, sometimes I can feel it, a presence or a path. I can learn something crucial. Maybe I can send a message to Robb. Maybe we can protect Sansa. Maybe we can..." He stopped, voice choking on emotion. The thought that Sansa might suffer at Joffrey's hands, or under Baelish's manipulations, tore at him. He remembered how Sansa used to brush her hair 100 strokes every night. How she'd dream of being a queen. Now that dream had turned into a cage. It was more than Bran could stand. Maester Luwin eyed him, pity shining in his grayish eyes. "If it eases your heart to seek answers, then I will not hinder you," he said quietly. "Though I ask that you not let the visions consume you. We still need your mind here, Bran." Bran nodded, grateful for Luwin's acceptance. A tension he hadn't realized he was carrying loosened in his chest. For a while, they spoke of simpler matters, the new bushels of grain in the storehouses, the repairs needed on the stable roof, the rotation of guards. The normalcy brought a measure of calm, even though behind every practical task lurked the unrelenting presence of war. Later that day, Bran visited Rickon. He found his younger brother in the crypts beneath Winterfell, where shadows seemed to writhe against the old stone walls. Rickon stood in front of Ned Stark's empty tomb. The stonemasons had begun carving it according to tradition, a statue of Ned with sword across his lap, flanked by wolves. Yet the statue's face was incomplete, the eyes mere hollows. The sight made Bran's gut clench. Rickon turned, hugging Shaggy Dog to his small body. The black direwolf regarded Bran warily, as if uncertain what to make of this intrusion. The crypt's torches flickered, illuminating Rickon's glistening cheeks. "I thought he might come back," Rickon whispered. "But he won't, will he?" Bran's throat felt tight. "No," he said softly. "He won't." They stood in silence for a time, just the two of them and the direwolf. The crypt's ancient dust caught in Bran's nose, making him want to sneeze. Finally he reached out, beckoning Rickon closer. "I miss him too," Bran whispered. "We have each other though, and we have Robb, fighting for us." Rickon sniffled, his breath hitching. "I heard the men talking," he said. "They said if Robb wins, maybe we'll get Sansa back, and everything will be right again." His young face twisted. "But that won't bring father back." Bran closed his eyes. "No," he repeated. "It won't." He thought of the vow he'd made to himself when the messenger had come bearing news of Ned's execution. He would do all in his power to ensure the rest of his family stayed safe, even if that meant stepping into the unknown path of his dreams. He wrapped Rickon in a one-armed hug. The boy buried his head in Bran's fur cloak, quivering. Eventually, they emerged from the crypts, guided by torchlight. The courtyard above felt almost blindingly bright compared to the gloom below, and for a moment, Bran was dizzy. Shaggy Dog and Summer bounded off together, tussling playfully despite the mood that hung over their human companions. Sometimes Bran envied the wolves' simplicity. Their instincts told them to guard or to play, not to brood over regrets. But the weight of duty would not let him cast aside his thoughts so easily. That evening, after a quiet supper of barley stew and fresh bread, Bran returned to the Godswood. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, a reminder that winter was nearing. He let Hodor wheel him across the small wooden bridge, over the dark waters, to where the weirwood tree stood with branches outstretched like crimson arms. The face carved into the trunk gazed upon him, ancient and silent, those eyes stained red as if forever weeping. Bran signaled for Hodor to stay at the edge of the clearing. He wanted to be alone. The big stable boy complied with a simple Hodor, stepping back to give Bran distance. Bran wheeled himself forward until he was almost beneath the heart tree's canopy. Then, gathering his courage, he set his hands against the gnarled bark, leaning in as if to whisper a secret. He felt the familiar rush of warmth and cold all at once, a tingling that traveled from his palms to his spine. He closed his eyes. In darkness, shapes began to take form. He saw a blurred corridor of the Red Keep, the flicker of torches on stone walls. Armed men stood on either side of a wide door, whispering among themselves. He seemed to drift through them as though a spirit, unstoppable. Then he was in a small chamber overlooking the Blackwater Bay. The window was open, a restless wind tugging at the heavy draperies. Sansa stood there, clad in a gown of pale blue. Her face was almost translucent in the moonlight, her eyes distant. Littlefinger approached from behind, quietly as a cat. He leaned in, speaking words Bran could not hear. But Sansa's expression turned uneasy, her hands clasping tightly before her. She looked older than Bran remembered, worn by grief and fear. Abruptly, the vision shifted. Bran soared upwards, passing through walls as if they were mist, until he reached a large, opulent hall. Bran knew it must be the throne room, though shadows clung to every corner. Petyr Baelish stood at the foot of the Iron Throne, conversing with a slender man wearing a chain of linked golden hands. Bran thought this might be the new hand of the king, but his face was hidden in the gloom. The two men spoke intently, their tones hushed. Then Littlefinger's lips curved into a smile. He glanced around as though aware of an unseen watcher. Bran felt a chill, as if those mocking green eyes stared straight at him. A presence bristled in the darkness, a sense of cunning and power. Suddenly, Bran's perspective lurched again. Now, he beheld the courtyard where Ned Stark had died. It was empty, lit by a single torch. The bloodstains were gone, scrubbed away, but the memory lingered. A figure moved across the stones, cloaked in black. As it passed, the torchlight revealed Baelish's face once more, half hidden in the cowl. He was alone, stepping carefully over the stones as though in thought. Then he looked up, eyes glinting with that same sly cruelty. Bran gasped, the shock of the vision twisting his stomach. He sensed that Baelish was rising higher in Joffrey's confidence, or at least weaving a new tapestry of alliances. The Queen might have no love for him, nor would the Lannisters necessarily trust him. But that was his strength. He thrived on secrets, playing each side against the other. And Sansa was but a pawn he might maneuver for his own advantage. The dream began to dissolve. Bran tried to hold it, to glean more detail. But the images scattered like crows before a hunter's arrow. His eyes flew open, heart hammering. He felt cold sweat on his brow. The weirwood's face loomed, serene and implacable, as if mocking his desperation. He pushed himself back, breath trembling. Hodor frowned in concern, stepping closer. Bran wiped his palm across his face. He was exhausted, drained by that brief glimpse. The godswood rustled with an evening breeze, and overhead, a raven cawed from the branches of an ancient oak. In that moment, Bran realized that, yes, Baelish was indeed consolidating his power near the throne. But how to use that knowledge? It only confirmed what they already suspected. Petyr Baelish was not an ally to House Stark, not truly. Nor was he loyal to the Lannisters or anyone else. He served his own ends. Sansa was at risk, trapped in a game of politics and potential suitors. The time for illusions was done. He let Hodor guide him out of the godswood, each turn of the wheels feeling heavier. The night air was chill, the faint stars peering through gaps in the clouds. In the corridor, they nearly collided with Osha, the wildling woman turned servant. She bowed awkwardly. "Lord Bran," she said, glancing at him with concern. "You look pale. Are you ill?" Bran shook his head, too weary to explain. "I'm all right," he said. "Just tired." Osha's dark eyes flicked to Hodor, then back to Bran. "Be careful in those woods at night," she murmured. "Magic's in the air there, old powers. They don't always let you go free." Bran thanked her, though the words caught in his throat. He had sensed that same primal force under the weirwood's bark, something beyond what he knew of the mortal world. He rolled past, allowing Hodor to escort him to his chamber. The journey through the torchlit halls felt strangely dreamlike, the stones echoing with each bounce of the wheels. Guards saluted as he passed, though their eyes lingered in question. Perhaps rumors spread that the crippled boy sought visions in the old god's domain. In his room, Bran's limbs felt as if they were made of lead. Hodor helped him undress, then settle into the bed. The furs and woolen blankets embraced him in warmth. But the chill in his bones remained. Once Hodor doused the torches, leaving only a single candle by the bedside, Bran lay awake, staring at the flickering shadows on the ceiling. He had seen Sansa's fearful face and Baelish's cunning smile. He thought of all that had gone wrong in so short a time. Could anything be done to stop further tragedy? Despite his determination, sleep overcame him in a slow wave. Dreams teased the edge of his consciousness, beckoning him back to that vantage of ravens. But the weariness pulled him under. At some point in the dark hours, he thought he heard a voice whisper in his ear. His father's voice, quiet and warm, telling him to hold on to hope. It faded before he could fully grasp the words. Morning dawned with a silver light. Bran woke groggy and sore, but forced himself to rise and go about Winterfell's duties. He accepted petitions from small folk who had come with complaints of bandits in the outlying forests, conferred with the steward about dwindling funds, and oversaw the assignment of 2 fresh guards to the gates. In every task, he sensed his father's legacy guiding him, yet he felt too small to fill Ned Stark's boots. The people did not complain. Far from it. They offered him gentle smiles, respectful bows, but he caught the flicker of pity in their eyes. A crippled boy, barely on the brink of manhood, guiding the North in a time of war. It was only the Starks' ancient bond with the land that made them trust him at all. Late that afternoon, a messenger arrived from White Harbor, bringing a letter from Lord Wyman, Manderley. He pledged men to Robb's cause, but he also requested that Winterfell dispatch a representative to confirm supply routes. Bran felt a prick of unease. In better days, Ned or Robb would have gone, or even Maester Luwin. But now... He looked at the assembled knights and elders in the hall. Only a handful were fit enough to undertake the journey, and none held the same status as a highborn Stark. Yet Manderley had asked specifically for a Stark representative, perhaps to assure his own men that House Stark was still strong and legitimate despite Ned's death. Bran wondered if he could make the journey himself, yet the distance was considerable, and he was unsure if he could endure the rigors of the road in his condition. Still, the thought stirred something in him. He was not just a frightened boy in a chair. He might prove himself worthy if he dared to travel. As he mulled this over, the older knights debated among themselves. Sir Roderick Castle was absent. He had gone with Catelyn to accompany her west. That left Sir Brynden fallen, a gray-haired warrior who had injuries from a past campaign and walked with a limp. There were other lesser knights, but none with the standing to speak for Winterfell. At last, Maester Luwine turned to Bran. "My lord, what shall we tell Lord Manderley? He expects an answer by Raven soon." Bran took a deep breath. "Write him and say that I will come," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. The hall quieted. "If I cannot ride a horse, I'll travel by litter or wagon. But the North must see that a Stark still lives and leads." There was a stir of murmurs. Some of the men looked concerned, perhaps imagining the dangers of the road. But Luwine studied Bran's expression and nodded gravely. "As you say, my lord," he replied. "We will make the necessary arrangements." That evening, he told Rickon that he would be away for a time, not long, just enough to reassure Lord Manderley and secure the North's unity. Rickon clung to him, eyes wide. "Don't leave me," he pleaded, tears forming. Bran's heart twisted, but he pressed a reassuring hand to Rickon's shoulder. "I have to," he said gently. "Winterfell will still be our home, and I'll come back. But we must keep our friends close. Father would want that." "Naun?" The next days passed in a flurry of planning. They prepared a sturdy wagon with cushions and furs, hammered out the itinerary, and assigned a handful of guards to escort Bran. Old Nan fretted endlessly, piling coats and blankets to ward off the cold. Hodor was to come as well, of course. Bran could scarcely manage without him. The final farewell approached like the roll of distant thunder. Winterfell's gates loomed, the road beyond stretching like a ribbon into the low hills. Before he departed, Bran spent one last afternoon in the Godswood, summoning courage and possibly more of those strange dreams. He settled beneath the weirwood, palm on the trunk. No grand vision came, just a faint sense of caution, an impression that the path ahead might hold as much danger as promise. Even so, he felt compelled to go. If he truly wanted to protect his family, to stop Baelish's machinations from dooming them all, he could not hide behind these walls forever. A Stark must show resolve, especially now that winter was coming. At dawn the following day, the wagon stood ready in the courtyard. 4 good horses were harnessed to it, and the men-at-arms waited on their mounts. Bran hugged Rickon goodbye. The younger boy watched with tearful eyes, Shaggy Dog at his side, while Summer bounded up to nuzzle Bran's hand in farewell. Hodor hefted Bran into the wagon, settling him among the cushions. Then, with a creak of wood and a flick of the reins, they rolled through Winterfell's gate. It felt strange to leave the only home he had ever known, to watch the gray walls and towers shrink behind him. A hush settled over the party as they moved into the wild. The farmland around Winterfell soon gave way to rolling plains. The wind swept across tall grasses, and overhead, the sky was a washed-out blue, pale and cold. Crows called from dead trees, and once Bran glimpsed a pair of wolves slinking away in the distance. That sight, at least, gave him a flicker of reassurance. House Stark had not forgotten its ancient bond with the wolves. They traveled for days, halting each night to make camp. The men pitched a canvas tent where Bran could sleep, safely away from damp ground. Maester Luwine had insisted he take warm clothing and good blankets. Even so, the northern nights were harsh, and he sometimes woke shivering despite the layers. Hodor loomed near him like a protective giant, ever ready to lift Bran if he needed to relieve himself or shift position. The men formed a ring of watchfires, telling low-voiced tales of battle and heartbreak. Bran lay awake, listening to the lull of their voices, mixing with the crackle of flames, the far-off hoot of owls, and the scuttle of animals in the brush. On the 4th night, as they neared White Harbor's domain, Bran had another vision, unbidden. He dreamt of being inside some hidden corridor in King's Landing, lit by smoky torches. A pair of voices rose in argument. One belonged to Sansa. He recognized her soft, wavering plea. The other was that sly, smooth timbre he had come to dread, Littlefinger. He could not make out their exact words, but the tension was thick, as though a thread held taut between them. Sansa turned, tears glinting on her cheeks. Littlefinger reached out to brush a tear away, but she recoiled, stepping back into the gloom. Then the dream wavered, and Bran seemed to glide forward. Littlefinger's eyes locked on him. He smiled, a mirthless curve of the lips. Bran jolted awake in the wagon, nearly crying out. Sweat chilled his brow, and his heart thudded a frantic rhythm. Hodor murmured from nearby, stirring at Bran's distress, but Bran patted his arm, signaling that it was all right. He sank back onto his makeshift bed, breathing hard. The dream haunted him. Sansa was caught in Baelish's snare. If only he could do something more than watch from afar. The next morning, the wagons and horses pressed on. By midday, they glimpsed the outer farmlands that supplied White Harbor. Grain fields and flocks of sheep dotted the landscape, interspersed with patches of wood. Smoke curled from the chimneys of farmhouses. Fishermen worked along a broad river, casting nets into the water. Soon after, the great city itself appeared, perched along the mouth of the White Knife. Unlike Winterfell, with its ancient stones and spare utility, White Harbor looked almost southern in style. Whitewashed walls, tiled roofs, an air of bustling trade. Bran found himself marveling at the wide harbor, where ships bobbed at anchor, sails flapping in the wind. A retinue of Manderly guards met them on the approach, each bearing Lord Wyman's banner, a merman with trident on a pale green field. They seemed surprised to see Bran in his wheeled chair, but they bowed respectfully. "Welcome, my lord," said their captain, a stout man with a salt and pepper beard. "Lord Wyman awaits you in the new castle. He bids you stay as his honored guest." Bran nodded, swallowing a wave of nerves. He had never journeyed so far from Winterfell. Maester Luwine offered quiet words of encouragement, and so Bran forced a smile and let the captain's men lead them through White Harbor's gates. The streets bustled with merchants, fishermen, and townsfolk. Many paused to stare at the small procession, and some bent the knee when they recognized the direwolf sigils. Bran heard whispers of Ned Stark's name, hushed references to his death in King's Landing, curses against the Lannisters. Passing through a final gate, they arrived in a courtyard paved with polished stone. The new castle rose beyond, a stout fortress built of white blocks that glimmered in the afternoon light. Guards in sea-green livery stood at attention. Bran felt a pang of homesickness for Winterfell's gray walls, but he steeled himself as Hodor lifted him from the wagon, placing him gently into his chair. Lord Wyman Manderly emerged from a wide door, his imposing figure robed in velvet and fur. He was as large as Bran had heard, a man of great girth and hearty presence. His face bore a complex mix of sorrow and determination. When his pale eyes fell on Bran, they softened with compassion. "You honor me with your presence, my lord," Manderly boomed, inclining his head. "I know it cannot be easy for you to travel, especially after the tragedy your house has suffered. Please accept my condolences for Lord Eddard. The North shall not forget." Bran forced a polite bow of his head. "Thank you, my lord. My father always spoke highly of the loyalty of White Harbor. We are grateful for your support in these dark times." Wyman pressed a hand to his heart. "We stand behind the young wolf, come what may. Our men will fight wherever he commands." His voice dropped slightly. "I only regret that we could not ride sooner. My city must be protected, but if the Lannisters think the North is leaderless, they err." Murmurs of agreement came from the men gathered around. Bran managed to smile. "They will learn differently soon enough." Manderly beckoned him inside. The corridors of the new castle were wide enough for Bran's chair to navigate without much trouble, though a few steps here and there required Hodor's aid. As they made their way to the Lord's private hall, Manderly explained the current state of the war as he knew it. Robb's victory at the Whispering Wood, the rumored battles raging near the Golden Tooth, and the precarious politics swirling in King's Landing after Ned's execution. He also mentioned rumors that Stannis Baratheon was claiming the throne, that Renly Baratheon had raised his own banners in the south, and that the realm was splintering into multiple factions. Bran's head spun. This war was bigger than the North's revenge. It was the entire kingdom unraveling. At last, they settled into a comfortable chamber overlooking the harbor. The windows were tall, and sunlight streamed through colored glass, casting hues of blue and green on the floor. Servants brought wine in trays of fish, fresh bread, and cheese. The men ate quietly at first, the mood weighted by the knowledge of everything that had transpired. Bran's appetite was small. He took only a little fish and bread, more out of politeness than hunger. When the meal concluded, Lord Wyman dismissed the others, keeping only a few trusted advisors in the room, along with Bran, Hodor, and Maester Luwin. Manderley's voice dropped to a confidential tone. "We in White Harbor are prepared to send more men to rob, and provisions as well. Grain, salted fish, and fresh coin from our vaults. But I must ask, do you believe the war will end quickly? Or will the young wolf march all the way to King's Landing? The people here fear a protracted conflict could bankrupt us." "Nasty Belmano." Bran hesitated. He was, after all, just a boy, hardly versed in the labyrinth of war strategy. But the men around him seemed to expect an answer. "Robb is cautious," he said carefully, recalling how his brother had always thought out the pros and cons of every action. "He won't rush headlong into the lion's den. But you've heard that he's captured Jaime Lannister. That gives us a strong bargaining piece. Maybe the war will end if the Lannisters decide to yield." "Bemercia." He swallowed, recalling the images in his dreams. Baelish was not the type to yield or to watch the Lannisters yield easily. But that was a matter too delicate to share in full. "As for King's Landing," he said, "it's hard to know. Too many forces gather there. The Queen Mother, Joffrey, the Council. Nothing is certain. Even if Robb frees Sansa, the realm might still be at war." The advisors exchanged worried glances. Lord Wyman frowned, stroking his thick beard. "Then we must brace ourselves," he concluded. "White Harbor will do its duty, but I must ensure the safety of my own folk too. If the war grows long, ships from the south may cut off our trade. We'd be forced to rely on purely northern commerce." He turned to Luwin. "Maester, perhaps you and I can discuss the details of supply lines. The Mander flows wide here. We could send barges upriver to the neck, yes?" Luwin nodded. "That would be most welcome, my lord. Let us speak after we've let Bran rest." The meeting ended soon after. Bran felt drained, as though he'd run a gauntlet. He was relieved when Manderley had him escorted to a set of guest chambers. The suite was far more ornate than anything in Winterfell, with intricately carved bedposts and colorful tapestries depicting sea creatures and mermen's court legends. From the balcony he could see the harbor, bustling with small boats and larger trading galleys rocking at their moorings. Gulls wheeled overhead, screeching. Hodor gently helped Bran to the bed, placing cushions behind him so he could sit upright. Once the servants had departed, Bran closed his eyes, listening to the sigh of the waves beyond the castle walls. A faint memory of Ned teaching him about the southern coast drifted through his mind. He pictured his father's sure hands tracing lines on a map. Now that voice was gone, replaced by the hum of the distant sea. Tears came unbidden, and he pressed a fist to his mouth to keep from sobbing aloud. He missed Ned so fiercely that it felt like a physical ache in his chest. Part of him still could not reconcile that his father would never step into the room with a gentle word, never guide him through Winterfell's courtyard again. He stared at the tapestry across from the bed, its swirling shapes blending together in his teary vision. He must have dozed, for the next thing he knew, a servant was knocking softly at the door to bring fresh water and a meal of oysters and stewed vegetables. Evening had arrived, painting the harbor in hues of pink and gold. Bran forced himself to eat. He wanted to be strong, to show Manderley and everyone else that a Stark was still capable. But his mind kept drifting to King's Landing, to Sansa, to the uneasy sense of doom he'd felt in the Godswood. Afterward, he asked Hodor to wheel him onto the balcony. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and fish. A pale moon was rising, almost full, casting a silvery path across the rippling water. Torches burned along the docks, where men worked late unloading crates from a tall-masted ship. Bran watched in silence. This was the largest city of the north, yet it was dwarfed by the scale of the kingdom's troubles. From below, he heard a clamor of bells, followed by cheers. One of Lord Wyman's knights came rushing along the walkway. Seeing Bran, the man bowed quickly. "My lord, a ship from Sisterton has arrived with news. Robb has crossed the Red Fork of the Trident and defeated a Lannister force near River Run. They say the River Lords have fully rallied to him, and the Kingslayer remains a hostage. The war goes well." Nena. Cheers rose again from the courtyard, where Manderley men had gathered to celebrate the rumors of victory. Bran's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and dread. Each victory was a step closer to a confrontation with the heart of Lannister power, and with the seat of Joffrey's reign. War was a slow beast, inching across the land, devouring all in its path. He looked out at the shimmering horizon, at the moon drifting over quiet waves. He let the night breeze brush his cheeks, breathing deeply. His father was gone, but Robb was forging a path. The North was not broken. Still, Baelish shadow loomed, intangible yet undeniable. Every time Bran closed his eyes, he saw that mocking grin. But if the gods had gifted him with visions, perhaps they meant for him to act in time. For now, all he could do was hold on to the faint glimmer of hope that the war's tide might turn in their favor, if only they remained strong, cunning, and true to the memory of Eddard Stark. At length he turned his chair from the balcony, signaling Hodor that he was ready to retire. Tomorrow, he would meet with Manderley again, discussing the final details of supplies, alliances, the gleaning of any fresh rumors from the south. He would do his duty as best he could. In time, he would return to Winterfell, or perhaps find himself drawn into the war's wider swirl. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but for the moment, he refused to succumb to despair. He allowed Hodor to wheel him to the bed and settle him under the covers. Outside, distant cheers and laughter lingered as the Manderley men toasted the rumor of Robb's triumph. Bran stared at the flickering shadows on the ceiling. The sea wind rattled the shutters, and his thoughts drifted like a boat on the tide, searching for safe harbor. Slowly, sleep enveloped him, carrying him into dreams where wolves roamed the Red Keep corridors and a cunning shadow slithered between columns. Yet even there, in the gloom of imagination, Bran clung to the faint hope that somehow, through all the sorrow and betrayal, the Starks might yet prevail.